All right. Good. Welcome, everybody. If you haven't had a chance, there is a sign-in sheet. We do like to keep attendance, not to hold you accountable, but so that we can kind of see the ebb and the flow through the year and have an understanding of kind of where folks are acclimating on topics. I'm Emily Ayler. I'm the recent chair of the Adult Formation. I'm now a committee member. So excited to come back in a new role. When Scott said he was going to be gone this week, he's at the men's retreat, and he said, I'll drop the book off on Friday. And I was like, we're doing Bonhoeffer. I've seen the books that Victoria has brought to past classes. They are not generally small. I didn't know what he was thinking, and he showed up with this one, and I was like, I can handle this. And then I was like, oh, no, it's still Bonhoeffer. And size really doesn't matter with him. And then I flipped through it and I was like, I'll just skim through it. You know, this will be interesting. And I see things like ground under one's feet. And I was like, it's slippery. Civil courage, I'm turning off the news. On stupidity, the day that I had on Friday. So it feels relevant, but I have to admit I haven't dug in completely. So I'm very excited to have our expert back to help us out. We'll do some Q&A and conversation along the way. So we hope this will be an interesting and compelling and collaborative session today. So welcome back and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I believe we're a little early because of communion. Yes, that's right. You have your priorities straight. So today was the day that we're going to discuss this. I don't know whether people have had a chance to read it. So I planned this morning's session with a series of prompts. And you've already answered some of the questions. So if people want to just sort of look at these phrases and say civil courage and, you know, speak spontaneously off the top of your head. But these are, if you were here last time around, these are the sections of his essay on After 10 Years. And as I said back then, sorry, I've got sort of frog in my throat. This is a letter that he wrote to members of his family and one of the leaders of the German resistance in December 1942. So it was a very bleak time in Germany itself, and as well as in the course of the war, and of course for Bonhoeffer and his family members and friends in the resistance. He and his brother-in-law Hans von Dohnanyi would be arrested just several months after this. So this is his summary of what has happened to Germany after 10 years of National Socialism. This is his series of reflections. And this is, you know, as it may be short, but it's not a quick read. Nothing about Bonhoeffer is, but this is something that I think one can read again and again, because it is written in such a way that you can begin to sort of dialogue with it. He's talking about his situation, but there are questions that arise for Christians throughout history, including in our present moment. He starts out, as I mentioned last time, with a series of sections where he's summarizing what's happened in Nazi Germany. So he's talking about no ground behind one's feet, the lack of civil courage, contempt. But then he sort of makes a shift, and you can see him theologically reflecting on what things might be able to help them, how they might think about the future, and how he himself has changed his mind on some things. So in terms of his personal story, I find it a very moving document. It's my favorite document. I've got water, thank you.
Oh, you do?
Thanks so much.
Okay.
I've got two introductory comments at the beginning. So he's writing to those closest to him. They're connected in the resistance against Hitler. So some elements here are very specific to that situation, which is not our own. However, there are things throughout this document that I think resonate with people. And so my opening question would be, assuming you've read it, and if not, that's okay, we'll get there. What moved you the most, or what struck you as you read through this? And you know, what parts of the Bonhoeffer remarks here kind of resonate with your own faith? And what do we learn about Bonhoeffer from reading this? So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, or if you have questions before we get started. Yeah.
So I was very, very moved by it.
But of course, I've only read it once, and there's a lot I haven't figured out yet, but in the bit on stupidity,
Mhm.
when he talks about liberation, and that's where I'm really trying to understand what that is and how that applies for us today. Where it says it only becomes clear that active liberation, not obstruction, can overcome stupidity. Because it's so true today. I mean,
Yeah.
it's amazing the things he says
Yeah.
and the relevance to today. And I don't understand, is there a way we can help other people?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a wonderful question. We could spend the next 45 minutes just on this. So I think it's important to understand that he's right.
Excuse me, I usually listen at home, and when the questions come from the floor, you can't hear them at all.
Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
so let me repeat the question. Thank you very much for that. For those who are listening from home, the question is in the section on stupidity. And her comment is that somewhere in here, he talks about how the answer to stupidity is liberation. What does that mean? Does that capture the essence of your question? Let me make sure that, just let me look very briefly and see if people are hearing me, because I asked them to. Okay, I'm assuming that they are. Nothing in the chat tells me otherwise. So stupidity, he's talking about stupidity here, not in terms of intellectual capacity, but as a moral failing. That is, he's talking about how Germans have made themselves stupid by deciding that there are certain things they're not going to see, there are certain things they're not going to talk about. They've got, they're going to focus on their personal lives, whatever that reason is why they don't want to address what's happening around them. He categorizes this as a form of what he calls stupidity. I had an email just this week from somebody who's read it and said, is there another word? Because stupidity, I mean, we automatically think, and if you say somebody's stupid, it's a very derogatory thing to say. The German word here is Dummheit, and is in earlier translations translated it as folly or foolishness. I think it's not. Foolishness is not quite what he's talking about here. And we had a lot of discussions about this when we were translating this document, and we ended up with stupidity with that cautionary note. I also added, I think last time, that the section that immediately follows this is the one warning people against feeling contempt. And I think that's quite intentional, where he's saying, don't just think these are other people, you're capable of this too. So that gets to a question about liberation. So the answer to this kind of, sort of closing one's world off because you don't want to deal with things, is to somehow free ourselves and free other people in a way that they can talk about it. And that's kind of what he's trying to do here, where he's talking about very grave matters and things that these people are in a plot for which they ultimately paid with their lives. So they knew how grave this was. But he also realized how grave the situation was in Nazi Germany. And so trying to get people to think in a way, and he does this from his perspective as a Christian, to free themselves to really recognize what's happening around them and to act from a position of faith. So I think that's where he's trying to go with that. Another question, yeah.
Yeah. I went to a retirement luncheon of a federal employee. And so I saw a bunch of people that I used to work with who are now on the firing line of everything that's going on. And I was really remembering when I did that, something that Larry said in his sermon last week, where he said, there's a time to seek sanctuary and to step back. And I would say to my friends in the government, keep your head down. And then there's a time where you can't do that. And I think what's really the hard part is knowing when to do which of those.
Yeah.
Because if you just go out and fight foolishly, you're going to get your head chopped off and be of no use to anyone.
Yeah. So the comment for people watching from home is with regard to current federal workers. One of our participants went to a luncheon with a number of people who are still at their jobs, And so the question is, when do you speak out? When do you keep your head down? How do you make these kinds of judgments? So it's we shouldn't just brush aside people and say, well, they're not being brave enough, because they're dealing with their situation in which many of them are staying in the system trying to work from within. This is, as I mentioned last time, this is exactly what Bonhoeffer's family members, including Hans von Dohnanyi, were doing. He was one of the top people at that point in the Ministry of Justice. He stayed in, when in 1933, he was horrified by what he saw happening around him and made an intentional decision to stay within that system to see what he could do. The fact that by 1942, they're talking about assassinating Hitler and overthrowing the government shows that they decided working within the system was not going to work. But they were in positions where they were able to acquire knowledge. Much of the information that international church figures got about what was happening in the concentration camps and the murders of the Jews, Dohnanyi sent that information out to people. One of the other plotters who received this letter, a man named Hans Oster, notified the Dutch and Belgian authorities before Germany invaded. So they were in the system where they had knowledge that they then tried to use, to undermine the regime. So it's an interesting question. I think that's just as we read that with the awareness that these are the kinds of things that Bonhoeffer is talking about here. Other questions before we get started? Okay, so what I thought I would do is go through each section, and you don't need to answer with everything, but if there are people who want to make comments about anything, especially if a section of this resonated. So the first section is, he begins the essay by saying, 10 years is a long time, so much has happened. How do we look at what has happened to our country? And he starts out by saying, we have no ground under our feet. Have there ever been people in history who, like us, had so little ground under their feet, people whom every possible alternative appeared equally unbearable? So that's the grim assessment that he begins with. Does that resonate with you? If you were to write this kind of assessment right now of your own situation, is this something that you would want to share? And I see we have a question in the chat. So, one contribution here: different kinds of humans, of which each of us are unique, offer different kinds of offerings to just such a time as this. So it's absolutely true. This is not a one decision fits all situation. These are all assessments that individuals have to make for themselves from their situation. Other comments about this first slide?
Yeah, I would say that in our situation, we've got it's different, I think, from how Germany was set up, because we all live in states.
Mhm.
And states' rights mean the states govern a lot. And so if you can appeal to your own state legislators and leaders, that's different, I think, than what they had in Germany, because Germany was not.
It had different states, but by 1942, this was a totalitarian system. The states had fallen in line. So the comment from the floor for those at home is that right now, in our system of government, we have 50 states, each of which has their own government, and so you have states making other kinds of decisions that, mean that we don't have a monolithic government in Washington. Other comments? Yeah.
But when we hear a comment that we should nationalize elections, electoral process, it certainly is a worry.
Yeah, so the comment is things about talk of nationalizing elections. That makes us fearful. That's a justification to worry. Other comments?
For me in the United States, I still have hope. But there are places for me like Gaza where no idea what to do. It's misery anyway, any direction you look.
Yeah. So the comment that in the United States, there's still some hope that we might be able to change our situation in a war-like situation like Gaza. That's a completely different scenario where you have an active war going on and a great deal of destruction and trying to you see the end of that conflict is difficult, and there are fewer options, I would say, for people on the ground. I mean, that's one real difference between a wartime situation and one in which, we're still pretty much going about our normal lives, many of us. So if there are no other comments, I'm gonna move along here because we might get bogged down otherwise. Let's see. So the next section is who stands firm. This is the section where he goes through all the different human virtues and says none of them work. Where he says, the great masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion. The notion, and Germans, were patriotic in 1933. They were fighting a war in 1942. So you had many Germans who said, no matter what, I've got to serve my country. That's, especially in the military, that's an ideal that you want people to have. Bonhoeffer's saying, the people who sort of blindly obey things may ultimately end up serving the devil, where he's pushing back at, the value systems that people were holding on to. He talks about, the man of conscience who decides that he's just going to do what he can within a certain sphere and really try to do good in that sphere. And Bonhoeffer, is critically pushing back and saying that leads you only so far in a system like what we have. So he's really wrestling with things that in ordinary times we would think of as virtue. And his conclusion of that section is the only way that you can stand firm is to throw yourself on the mercy of God and follow the teachings of Christ. I mean, he's writing this from a Christian perspective. Comments today? Yeah.
Excuse me if I've got the wrong section here, but I do recall reading into this that Bonhoeffer is coming from a perspective of German history. And was this the section where he's talking about the Germans' inclination to stand together to serve the whole, and which comes from a rather late history of German unification, and the need to bring the country together, hold together as a country. So there's this cultural view of people need to pull together to serve the state.
Yeah. So the question was, is this a section where, and it is, to say that, the section where Bonhoeffer is talking about, and one of the values the Germans had, were to really sort of pull together, stand as one, serve the nation. And of course, this is intensified in 1942 because they're fighting a war. So many people who have family members on the front, even if they disagree with what the Nazis are doing, they feel an obligation to somehow serve the country. They're afraid of speaking out otherwise. And so, Bonhoeffer pushes back a little bit at that, where he's looking at all these things that in ordinary times, as I said, that's how people would behave. And he's saying, but we really need to question everything we're doing here. Are there other questions or comments? Let's move on. Civil courage. What lies behind the lament about the lack of civil courage? He talks about the fact that the people in the resistance are courageous, but they're surrounded by people in the government who just don't have the gumption to speak out or stand up. And part of the background of this particular statement is that in the December of 1942, the German army was still fighting the war in Russia. It had not yet been defeated, but that was coming. And the generals who were leading, and up to that point, Germany had been unbelievably successful in occupying most of Europe. So every country they invaded fell within days. And as long as that was happening, the German generals didn't want to turn against the regime. And he's pointing specifically at this issue and saying, they know this is wrong. They know what they're doing is wrong. Why can't they stand up to this? What is the root of this? And so he explores that thematically. So if we think about our own time, so where do we see civil courage today? And what aspects of life give us that kind of courage? What things nurture such courage in people?
Minneapolis.
Answer was Minneapolis. Other thoughts? So that means sort of citizen engagement where people are getting out and really getting engaged. Yes.
Lawsuits where the Trump administration has been taken to court and many times has lost.
Yeah.
And so
So-
there's been some.
Yeah, so one comment is the lawsuits and the legal cases in which people have successfully fought back against certain things. I think I don't remember if I said this a couple weeks ago. It's interesting throughout the 1930s that Germans can still go to the courts and sometimes win against the regime. So that was, that ends with the wartime situation. But up to that point, there were the most famous case is Martin Niemöller, the minister in Dahlem, who was in the Confessing Church, who was tried for treason. And he had been a decorated World War I commander. So the court dismissed the lawsuit, and Adolf Hitler immediately turned around and ordered him privately arrested. So Hitler did not, Hitler said, no, we're not going along with that decision. And that's the point at which Niemöller is then sent to a concentration camp and stays there until 1945.
I have a question from home.
Dictatorship of what you can do, but
I have a question from home.
My hope would be anybody or everybody who disagrees with the current
Working.
administration would really focus on the midterm.
Mhm.
And, use our system that's in place to try to, slow down, stop, whatever, and get some different people in power. I think the real challenge is gonna be if that doesn't go well, if it's tried to be nationalized, if people try to cheat on it, I don't know what's gonna happen after that.
So the comment was, and I'm looking to see if there are any other comments here, that we're in a situation in which we have elections coming up. So that also offers a possible point of change, and the scenario will change if that if something happens to stop that from if the elections are stopped or if there's some obvious interference. Yes.
So a wackadoodle one, Marjorie Taylor Greene, does anybody else think she's an example of civil courage?
So the comment was taking somebody who changes their mind publicly and breaks with the leadership, and Marjorie Taylor Greene is obviously a prominent example. So that courage, individuals who show courage in public, especially public figures who has something to lose, do I think inspire other people where it gives them a model of sorts for something. There's a wonderful story. I don't know if people are familiar with the story of Les Charbons in France. This was the village that saved about 6,000 Jewish children. And this was in Vichy, France. So the Gestapo, came through and the entire village decided they were going to hide Jews. But one of the first acts of defiance, and this was before they began to rescue people, was that the mayor was, this was Vichy France, so the German flag was supposed to go up in the schoolyard, and the mayor refused to raise the flag. And the comment of one of the people who studied this said, once people saw that single act of defiance, I'm not going to raise the banner, that gave them a model where they thought, okay, so this is possible. Maybe we can do some things here. So just seeing an example of that is, the kind of thing that gives people courage. So this is where he talks about success. This is a complicated, parts of this essay are really complicated, and you have to know the story. Part of this is, as I said, the German generals were successfully waging the war. And as long as they were being successful, they weren't going to try to overthrow the regime. And so he's saying, success is not neutral. You can't just say because you're winning that everything's all right. And then he goes on to say, so the question is whether it's ethically more responsible to battle against the new age or concede defeat and say, well, okay, this is where we stand. I guess I'll have to do something under this new system. And here again, he's always coming back to his Christian faith, where he says, if a Christian sees injustice, we serve a different Lord. So that should clarify how we view something like worldly success. Comments, insights?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I think was one of the more interesting pieces.
Oh.
It's such a difficult balance to strike,
Yeah.
and that you need in moments like this, quixotic figures who are going to sort of sacrifice their career
Yeah.
or what have you to speak out appropriately. But you also do still need the people who are willing to engage with the system to, as you said earlier, to
Yeah.
change it from within. And that requires a bit more prudence, a bit more understanding of political capital, and when do you expend your resources versus when do you keep your powder dry. And so you kind of need a bit of both. And it's a bit more difficult to be the latter. You don't get as much credit for it, but it's incredibly important, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. The
Can you-
comment was that it's a difficult call because you need people who are willing to fight openly against the system and stand up for something else. But you also need the people who choose their battles and perhaps don't get the glory that they're due, but they're showing tremendous courage in their own situation. Now I'm going to look and see because I think we've got another comment. Sorry.
Hey, I have a comment. Question. Can you hear me?
It's not.
Can you hear
I'm
me?
seeing things on my screen that make me.
Can you hear me?
What I'll do, for the benefit of those at home, I will address the comments at the end. I think that's the best way to do this. Any other comments on this one?
Is this also where he starts looking to the future generation?
He's getting there. Yeah, this is the beginning of that transition. And one of the interesting things about Bonhoeffer is he wrestled with the story of Don Quixote from the 1920s on. I mean, he was raised in the generation of Germans who were idealistic and they were going to restore their country. And at some point he thought, but what does this battle really mean? And so he really struggled with that notion of being ridiculous, of fighting a war that doesn't need to be fought, versus, and he has other figures that he then looks at that he sort of sees as embodying the kinds of values that he stands for. Yeah.
It was interesting, at the beginning of this week, a study came across my desk from someone else. It was on moral leadership, and which you don't normally see a lot about moral leadership because it's kind of subjective and it's based on a lot of things. And it was a fairly large study, and it talked about, from a corporation standpoint, moral leadership at a management level or a quote unquote executive leadership level, and how much more you can do through moral leadership. And I actually shared that with like 50 people at my company, as I know folks are wrestling with a lot of things. I really looked at the generational data in there to see, and there was something about, the next generation's gonna make the decision on whatever we did was good or bad, which is always the case. But one of the things it talked about was folks are always looking for answers. They're looking for a conversation or an acknowledgement or a space to come together. And so as I was looking at some of this and thinking about that and thinking about showing up at work when I have folks who love what's going on, folks who are devastated by what's going on, some who are 50-50, some who are so overwhelmed they don't even know where to start, is how to show up beyond the church to have that in an open space. And so for me, it didn't really give me answers, but it gave me how do I make space, or how do I demonstrate something for the next generation to strengthen it, or to model something, or to show how awkward it is to do this, and to say, I don't have anything to say. I'm going to sit here in case somebody wants to show up. But I've tried to just look at things a little differently. If I don't know where I can solve something, how do I make space for people in the moment? And so that's what came to mind for me.
Yeah, that's a great comment. So for the folks at home,
It was a lot, sorry.
well, no, so the question or the comment was about moral leadership and how this is something that I think we're seeing more literature on this right now, and what that really means. How do you address the topic of moral leadership if you're operating a company in which there's a real division opinion about political options and what people should be doing, and about other things. And so how does one take the conversation up to the level of moral leadership to get everyone thinking about the moral implications of where they stand? And I think that's one of the things that Bonhoeffer is trying to do here. And he does it, as you noted, by talking about the responsibility to the coming generation. He said, okay, so, we're not going to look like heroes maybe, but what do we do right now to give something to the next generation so that they really have a set of values? And this is something, he doesn't give easy answers here. He's talking about, how he's struggling with this and getting other people to talk about it. Yeah.
To me, the situation that we're in right now, where our country is divided 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever, is, okay, forget this administration. They're going to go away sooner or later, one way or another. But how do we bring the country back together? Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if there isn't some big role for Christians or the organized church or somebody to play in that. Mm-hmm. Because I just think, as you just said, you can't sit back and say, well, I was right about this and you were totally wrong. That's not going to get us anywhere. And I think a lot of people are doing that right now.
And Pat, does adult formation have a thing for you? A little public service announcement, and I'm pointing my finger for those who can't see. Scott is working, it is a national endeavor called Faith 250. It's created by a Jewish rabbi from up north. That's the specifics, that's all I got. But there's one going on out in another area of this region, but it is a multiple denominational endeavor to come and talk about, I'm going to use the word American things. So he just went to one out at Burke, and at his table there was someone who was Jewish, Latter-day Saints, Episcopalian, Methodist, and they tried to get all of them at each table in small groups. And there was conversation on the flame of the liberty in the Statue of Liberty. And so it is all religious, but the context is secular and about the country. So that will be most likely happening here in the spring. And he's finding different types of churches and synagogues and mosques to come and collaborate and go and do this in community for, I think it's a 4 or 6 week endeavor. So.
Okay, so for the folks at home.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Read the bulletin.
No, that's what kind of what I was going to say. So the question was about moral leadership and how to, what role faith might play in that. And I would say not just Christianity, but the other faith groups that we have in this country to push for a different kind of conversation about these things. Again, I think that's what Bonhoeffer is kind of doing here within a limited circle. But the announcement was that there is going to be a program, an entire program here at Westminster on moral leadership and looking at what some of the different models are around the country for beginning to have these kinds of conversations about the future. Is that okay? So let's move on to the next one. So here's stupidity. As I said, we kind of talked about this earlier. The Bonhoeffer is not talking about people who are stupid, but he's talking about something much deeper, where there's something that is preventing them from embracing their ideals, being able to speak out for various reasons, and how one should fight against that. We talked a little bit about that, so I'm going to move ahead to the next one, contempt for humanity. And as I said, he follows the thing on stupidity, I think, to prevent his listeners from feeling too comfortable, where he says there's nothing there that we're not capable of ourselves. So what does that mean for how we deal with one another? And this gets back to the point you were just raising about having different kinds of conversations. We must learn to regard human beings less in terms of what they're doing or neglect to doing, more in terms of what they're suffering. What's moving people with whom we disagree in the direction they're going? How does one practice that kind of empathy What things can we think of on a daily basis? I pray every day, so, and I sometimes pray and I think, okay, so keep me from being too self-righteous today, or, whatever your version is. But the question is, going out into the world at the beginning of the day in the spirit of encounter and trying to meet people where they are and modeling a certain kind of moral leadership, if you will, in international or in interpersonal relationships, or also communal ones, so that we're not, we've become, I mean, especially if you look at social media, I mean, we're unbearably snarky right now. And I don't think that helps anyone. So how do we model something else? Any comments? Or
Well, can you hear me at all?
All of the attention and the growth that came out of the Walk for Peace. That one, it was in some ways a lesser known or maybe misunderstood faith. I think a lot of folks think they know it, but maybe they don't know a lot about Buddhism and to see that, or, the practice yoga and that's it, or, there's so much more to it. So I thought that was neat to bring to light something other than Christianity. It started with a whisper. I mean, I didn't hear about them until they were halfway across, and to hear that, and then bringing in of the dog and the, all the weather element, and they were staying with different faith denominations, and how it came through different folks in my community that this was not their normal kind of state of being. So I just thought that was very hopeful and very great to model.
That's a wonderful insight, because I know, I mean, I have friends, and my son and his family went down to see them last weekend. And it's kind of surprised me that they had heard about this, they really wanted to experience it. So for the folks at home, we're talking about the Walk for Peace of the Buddhist monks who began in Texas and ended up here in Washington last week, and the way in which that set a certain buzz throughout the whole country, where people came out to see them, people from different backgrounds. And so it's clear, if we counter this contempt for humanity, it's clear that there's a real hunger for that kind of witness. And that's what really struck me in terms of seeing, who came out to see them and how profoundly moved people were. So yes.
Excuse me. I had recently shared with Larry, an interview with James Martin that I read in the New York Times. I don't know if you saw that. It spoke to me because one of his key points in that article was that we should all treat every single person with dignity, no matter their views, where they are in the world. But I thought, boy, that seems a pretty difficult but simple thing that we could all do.
So the comment was a recent interview with James Martin, who is a Catholic priest, in the New York Times. And I don't know if you just want to look it up online, you'll find him. It is a wonderful interview, and Martin is just remarkable. But the one of the things he really emphasizes is the importance of treating every single person we encounter with dignity and respect, and that simply those kinds of practices set a different kind of model. And I think that's that comes through in Bonhoeffer as well. I mean, he was apparently that kind of person as well. So imminent justice, and if we don't get through all this, I will send this out. I'll send this to Scott, and he can share it with people. So this is where he's beginning to look ahead. He says, so we're waiting for God's kingdom. When is it? When is it coming? Is it? And he, one of his questions is, history. In discernment, the wise person acts well, and the good person acts wisely. History's imminent justice rewards and punishes the deed only, but there's the judgment of God, which is very different and judges our hearts. And so thinking of how we appear to others in a moment, or thinking about how people are going to look at us in 10 years or 20 years, and thinking about how we are living our lives in a way that, when we come to that point in God's judgment, we can answer for what we've done. That is really doing our best according to a different law and a different understanding of faith. And so he's trying, I think, to discern those different levels here. Where he's saying, we're acting at a certain point right now within Nazi Germany in a way that we think is just, and, history is going to either judge us or punish us. But there's another judgment there that we should be thinking of. I mean, I think that's his main point here. Is that a useful way to think about this, or do people have thoughts? We can move along. You don't have to, but these are just some of the things he says.
Well, I'll make a comment
Yeah,
there.
okay.
Sometimes, because we're in the church and we talk to each other and we all believe in God, but you may be talking to somebody out there who doesn't believe in
Right,
God.
right.
But they may very well believe in treating people with kindness and a lot of the things that we are taught as Christians to do. And so you can establish some rapport there that don't you want, people to be treated fairly? And what if it were you that was just being snatched off the street and sent home?
Yeah. So the comment from the floor is that, of course, not everyone in the world and not everyone in our society is Christian. And there are a growing number of so-called nuns, people who are, of no faith, but they live according to certain principles and they behave kindly toward other people. And keeping that in mind, I think also in terms of God's judgment, God's not checking off boxes in terms of, you're Christian? Okay, let's see what you did here. But sort of judging, I mean, that's what Bonhoeffer means, I think, when he says judging the heart. Just, to, sort of judge and see people through that lens. So he moves on now to statements of faith on God's action in history. And when I send Scott this is actually a short section. It's my favorite section in the essay. And so when I send this to Scott, I'll include the full thing. But this is, I would say Bonhoeffer's faith, where despite what they're in the middle of, he is saying he believes that God will let good come out of everything, even the greatest evil. For that to happen, God needs human beings who let everything work out for the best. There's a wonderful statement in here. Let me actually find it so I don't misquote it. I believe that even our mistakes and shortcomings are not in vain, and that it is no more difficult for God to deal with them than with our supposedly good deeds. I love that because it's kind of a push. Don't feel too self-righteous. You're going to fail, and God will understand both your failures and your attempts to do the right thing. So, what are the kinds of things here at Westminster that help bring you there? I mean, I think we're entering the part of the essay where he's speaking from the viewpoint of his faith and the community that he has built in the confessing church, which for him was incredibly important. If you've ever read Life Together, his little book about living as a Christian in community, that's the book he wrote from that experience. And he has his seminarians do daily confession, do daily prayer, do daily devotions. There is really a daily routine of faith, in addition to teaching them theology, and then they all go out in the afternoon and they play sports or something. I mean, he was really trying to sort of seek the balance of faith and works and, also, joy and pleasure and just getting things off your mind. So what, if you're going to believe in God's action in history, what daily practices help you do that? Oh, I thought you were about to say something. You don't need to.
Well, I'm thinking of in the book of James, he says, you can't just look at somebody and say, oh, I wish you well and be on your way. You've got to look to their basic needs. You've got to feed the hungry. And you've got to try to house the homeless and meet those basic needs. And I think we do that at Westminster. We've done a lot of programs like the Magnon program and supporting Alive and various other ways of helping people to meet their basic needs.
So the comment was that at Westminster that, in keeping with many of the teachings in the Bible, we have to take care of one another. We have to feed the hungry, we have to help the homeless, and that there are a number of programs here that people get involved in that do that, which I think is one of the strengths of a religious community like this one.
I completely agree, especially from a communal perspective, the mission work is incredibly important. And I think from an individual perspective, there's also keeping a sense of relentless optimism and understanding when to unplug in this day and age. That doesn't mean to make yourself stupid, right? Don't become uninformed, don't, disengage entirely, but understanding when, you're reading of something or engaging with the news is maybe not so productive, and perhaps going and taking a walk or reading or being with your family is a more productive thing for your health.
Yeah. So another comment is, in addition to doing good works, also retaining and nurturing the capacity to take a break, to stop reading the newspaper, to take a walk, to do things that fulfill that part of you that needs fulfilling. I mean, we all need that balance in life, and I think it's too easy to get lost in the turbulence of our world. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
I'm reminded, I was meeting with some friends, and so I said at the beginning, let's not do Ain't It Awful today. Let's not, and people were kind of quiet. And so I think that, trying to maintain optimism and encourage optimism in each other is really important.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. So the comment was that it's also important when we get together with friends and family, and that we just don't immediately descend into comments about how awful everything is, but to really look for other parts of life that we can be talking about, nurturing that in others. And I think that's part of what Bonhoeffer was also really trying to do. He read novels. He was a very gifted pianist. He listened to music. He went to the theater. It's interesting when you look at the sheer volume of his writing and realize how much of his time, he apparently was a quick writer, and obviously a brilliant scholar, but it's the people who knew him also talk about that side of it. And I think that was something that his family very intentionally nurtured among all of them. And that was one of the real strengths of that family. Yeah.
My problem is just the opposite, though. I have in many encounters where I'm really concerned about X, Y, and Z, and people say, oh, let's not talk about unhappy things like that. Let's just talk about something joyful. And I get frustrated.
Yeah, so the comment is the opposite. When you're around people who simply don't want to talk about things, and there are things that you're really wrestling with, or engaged in. And so finding that balance and finding ways, and in some cases it means finding a different, there are people with whom I can have honest conversations and people with whom I can't. And so discerning, where you stand in all this, and, deciding also where you want to put your energies, I think is part of that balance. So the next one is about trust. So this is, and again, this I think really speaks to the situation of the resistance, where he says, we've all been betrayed. We're breathing air that is so poisoned that we're almost dying from it. But where we've been able to break through that layer of mistrust, we found a trust that was entirely undreamed of. That kind of gets to your question, where in a situation like, and Bonhoeffer is in a very specific situation, but the experience of not being able to trust people, of not knowing, I'm thinking of the federal workers, for example, who really have to be careful in terms of what they say, what they put on social media. How do you create that fabric of trust, perhaps in personal conversations, perhaps reaching out to somebody and just saying, do you want to talk? I think there are ways to think about how we can nurture that in ourselves, and within the circles within which we move, and understanding that each person's in a different situation. Sense of quality. So this is where Bonhoeffer's Prussian upbringing comes in. This is the passage that many people, I have the most difficulty with, because he begins to talk about the rabble. And this, I mean, this is the, this was his family background. This was the background of the people. There was a real class consciousness that they had been raised according to certain values and ideals, and they were well educated and they appreciated certain things. And he talks about how people need to go back to reading books and not newspapers, and they need to, so he's clearly making some judgments here that are foreign to our ears, and perhaps we would criticize them, that there are ways in which each human being, no matter what their background, can find quality in life. But he's talking about a certain kind of value, I think, that in Nazi Germany especially, and Nazi Germany was an ugly society. I mean, from the very beginning, it was one of the things that turned the Bonhoeffer family against the regime from the get-go, because of their mocking, people, making fun of people, brushing aside people. I mean, there was sort of an ugliness of the human interaction, and I think he's trying to get at that. And what he's saying is that Christianity in particular, the Christian faith, really should defend the respect for human boundaries and human qualities. So, for example, I mean, one of the things that Nazi propaganda did was, because they ended up with this policy of murdering people with disabilities. And from 1933 on, you've got posters in Nazi Germany that are very crudely portraying people with disabilities to dehumanize them. So the act of dehumanizing someone else and making fun of them, mocking them in public, that kind of ugliness is what he's reacting to. And where he's saying, Christian, if someone's a Christian, they don't do that, because we're all creatures of God. And so I think he's trying to get at that aspect of what's happening around him, and trying to recover that aspect in terms of what he's thinking about. That questions, comments? So now he moves from there to sympathy. And in a way, he could also use the word empathy here. I mean, I think what he's talking about is kind of an empathy, where he says, we're not Christ, but if we want to follow Christ, we have to take part in Christ's greatness of heart, and in the true sympathy that comes forth not just from fear, but from sort of a redeeming love for other people. So again, this is the kind of thing that we can nurture, and that he nurtured in himself throughout his life. So what spiritual and worship practices, help us get there? Comments?
So I found this section to be juxtaposed against the civic action and having letting God work everything out. It's a little uncomfortable with his balance at various points.
Interesting.
Between active measures and passive. God will work everything out in the fullness of time, in judgment, in reading men's hearts, and in God's role in history, shaping history. So this role of on one end you're active and engaged, and the other end you're on the knife's edge of sort of being resigned, or maybe I'm doing all I can do, or maybe we just let God work everything out in the end.
Yeah, that's a wonderful insight. So the insight was the juxtaposition in this essay between sort of this reliance on God's will guiding history, and the almost passive nature of some of what he seems to be saying here. Am I capturing what you were saying?
And I mean it comes through at the very end, from the bottom.
So, and the comment was, and this comes with the conclusion, I mean, we're going to have to wind up soon, but the conclusion where he talks about reliance on Christ. So I think this ties very much into Bonhoeffer's understanding of discipleship, if you've ever read that book. And so he is talking as a Christian who has decided to devote his life and his future to Christ. And he understands what he is doing throughout the 1930s and 40s as the path that God is leading him into. So there is, on the one hand, sort of this passive reliance, but also a taking of responsibility. And we probably haven't talked about that enough, but that's in here as well, which is that, we rely on Christ, but we have to stand up for what we did. And that's our free will. That's, we take responsibility for God. And if we messed up, that's we take that upon ourselves. So there's an active aspect there. And one thing I should say is that a lot of the sections of this essay are in his manuscripts about ethics, which he writes around the same time. So he was clearly working on ethics and pulling things out to send to his friends. But the point of ethics is this notion of responsibility, that we take, we don't turn everything over to God. We have to actively participate in history. So I would say that sort of is the balance he's trying to get there. Now, you see, we've got 5 minutes. Like I said, I'll send this around to everyone. But let me come to the last 3 sections. So this is where he talks about optimism and how, given where they are, there's no reason to feel optimistic. But he says it's not a way of looking and judging the present situation, but it's a power of hope when others resign. And I think that's such a wonderful way of putting it, where you believe in the future, not because it looks like things are going to turn out, but you believe in the future because you stand for a kind of hope that transcends history. And I was talking to somebody else last week about this, trying to sort of explain this. Years ago, when I was going through a really tough period in my life, a very wise friend said to me, "So you need a crystal ball." And then she said, "And since you don't have a crystal ball, you have to create your crystal ball. And so what is it that you hope for out of this situation? What are you willing to work for and stake your future on?" And that clarified things for me in a way that was at the time very helpful. And I've thought of that through the years. And I think that's kind of what he's talking about here, is no reason to be optimistic. So what do you hope for? And that's where he begins to turn toward, he goes back to peril and death. But he also, comes here to the final passages where he talks about the possible future. And he begins by saying, are we still of any use? This is this remarkable quotation: "We've been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We've become cunning. Experience has rendered us suspicious. And often we've failed to speak to them a true and open word. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down. Are we still of any use? How are we going to, what kind of future are we creating if we can't come out of this? Do we have enough inner strength to do this?" And again, I think this is, where he's going in terms of hope and his faith. And then he concludes with this view from below, where he says it remains an experience of incomparable value that we have once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of suffering. And he says, if only during this time our hearts have not been corroded by bitterness, that, we can look forward to the future and create a different kind of hope. And that's where he concludes the essay. And I think it's a remarkable essay in his moment, but also, in terms of, how he's carving out what he sees as the future. And it's one reason I think that it resonates so deeply with people today. Now, I apologize because we're coming to the end of our time, and I will see if there are any questions from the group at home. I don't see any. Any closing comments you want to make before we leave? Like I said, I will send this to Scott so that you've got this series of questions to think about. Yes.
I'm thinking about something my father said to me many years ago. He said, some people live and learn, and other people just live and keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. And my hope is that people do for the most part, eventually learn. That if they see that things are not working, then they say, okay, something's got to change. And so I have some hope there that people do learn to do better.
So the closing remark, I think, from the audience was that we learn from the present time and allow that hope to change the future, not just learn and give up or fail, but that we really learn from our current experience and do what we can to make the next, the world for the next generation a better world.
One more.
Oh, I just wanted to say how grateful I am that the church here is willing to put on a program like this.
Thank you. Gratitude that the church is willing to, Westminster is willing to put on a
It's
program
your
like this.
petition.
And I will add, I always like coming here because I really enjoy the conversations and appreciate what you all are doing so much. So thank you.
Thank you for taking us into uncomfortable waters in a lot of ways and helping us kind of process together as a community. And there was one sentence that kind of jumped out at me is, we will not need geniuses, cynics, people who have contempt for others, or cunning tacticians, but simple, uncomplicated, and honest human beings. And so with that, I will encourage you, if you did not hear it at early service, if you go to service at 11, Jacob will be talking about vulnerability, which I feel like plays a piece of all of this for us to connect with others, for us to figure out how we want to show up, what vulnerability has to do with community. So thank you for coming. Have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday.
Thank you.
Exactly.